Movies make knight combat look flashy, but real medieval fighting was fast, cramped, and brutally practical. Knights used their weapons in ways that were nothing like the big swinging moves on screen, and the truth is far more intense. Number 1. The reality behind knightly weapons. People grow up imagining knights as dramatic, sword-swinging heroes, but the truth is way more grounded, and honestly, way more brutal. In real medieval England, a knight didn't march into a battlefield thinking about cinematic sword choreography. He was thinking about surviving mud, chaos, screaming men, the weight of steel plates pressing on his chest, and the fact that one wrong step could get him trampled. Knights weren't performing. They were problem-solving under life or death pressure. Every weapon they carried had a very practical purpose, shaped by centuries of actual warfare, not by Hollywood's obsession with big, flashy swings. The environment they fought in was cramped, smoky, noisy, and unpredictable. In armor, your peripheral vision shrinks to 2 thin slits. You can't see someone running at you from the side. You can barely hear commands over clashing metal and terrified horses. You're breathing hot air recycled inside your helmet, and you're expected to make split-second decisions while someone with a mace is trying to dent your skull like a piece of cheap cookware. The image of knights engaging in clean one-on-one duels is a modern fantasy. Real battles were closer to rugby fights with lethal tools. Knights fought in dense formations, shoulder to shoulder with their own men. They weren't dancing around each other. They were shoving, grappling, slipping in the mud, using shields as battering rams, and hitting whatever part of the enemy they could reach. Armor changed everything. Against a man in padded cloth or mail, yes, swords could slice flesh, sever tendons, and do serious damage. But as plate armor advanced, slashing became almost pointless. You could strike full force and still do nothing but annoy your opponent. That's why knights adapted their entire fighting style. Instead of wide, sweeping movements, they used tight, controlled techniques aimed at tiny gaps where armor plates connected. They struck at the armpits, the inside of elbows, the groin, the neck opening, and the visor slit. These weren't random targets. They were engineered vulnerabilities. Combat manuals from medieval Europe show knights half-swording, gripping their blade halfway up to guide it like a spear. They weren't afraid of cutting their hands. Swords weren't razor-sharp along the entire length because they weren't meant for slicing armor. They were meant for thrusting into joints. If they needed blunt force, they didn't hesitate to flip the sword and use the pommel like a hammer. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Knights also relied heavily on wrestling. This might sound surprising, but armored grappling was essential. If you could knock someone down, their armor became a prison. A knight on the ground, especially if he fell badly, was in deep trouble. His visibility was worse. His mobility was gone. Getting up required time he didn't have. Opponents would swarm him, pin him, rip off his helmet, and finish him with a dagger. So a lot of knight training focused on balance, footwork, and resisting being thrown. This wasn't elegant martial arts. It was dirty fighting hip pushes, trips, knee drives, grabbing the opponent's helmet and yanking. Manuals show knights hooking legs with their own, pushing the enemy's weight offline, and twisting arms to force a fall. None of this shows up in movies because it's not pretty, but it's how battles were actually won. And behind every knight stood an entire support system: squires, men-at-arms, archers, shield-bearers, servants caring for the warhorse, armorers adjusting plates, and weaponsmiths checking gear. A knight wasn't a lone hero. He was the centerpiece of a small military machine. In battle, his survival depended on the men beside him just as much as his own skill. Movies love showing knights charging alone, but that's suicide. Real knights fought in coordinated groups because otherwise they'd be surrounded, stripped of their initiative, and overwhelmed. The romantic idea of chivalric combat existed mostly in literature. The battlefield was a different world one, where strategy, teamwork, and brutal efficiency ruled everything. Number 2. The Lance A Knight's First Strike. If Hollywood awarded Most Misrepresented Medieval Weapon, the lance would win in a landslide. People think jousting tournaments represent real combat, but tournaments were like medieval sports practice, not actual war. The lance on a real battlefield was far more devastating. It transformed knights into guided missiles, turning a disciplined formation of mounted warriors into a shockwave powerful enough to shatter enemy lines. And contrary to movies where knights gleefully charge from half a kilometer away, real lances were used with carefully timed, tightly packed group charges. Formation discipline mattered more than raw courage. 10 knights charging together were infinitely more dangerous than one knight riding alone like a wannabe superhero. A proper mounted charge started slow. Knights didn't gallop across the entire field because horses would be exhausted before impact. Instead, they trotted towards the enemy in controlled ranks. Only in the last several dozen meters did they kick into a full charge, lowering their lances at the final moment so the line stayed tight. If a knight lowered his weapon too early, his horse might veer off from the sudden shift in balance. War horses were trained for violence, but they weren't stupid. If something felt off, they would resist. Knights spent years learning to coordinate with their horse, shifting weight, gripping with their knees, and managing the lance's enormous leverage. A lance wasn't just a spear on steroids, it was a massive wooden shock weapon, often reinforced to prevent premature breaking. But breaking was expected. Knights didn't plan to reuse the lance. The idea was simple. Hit the enemy with the full force of a warhorse and armor, break the lance on impact, and immediately transition to the next phase of combat. What movies get wrong is the aim. Knights weren't trying to hit the center of the body. They aimed for the edges, where armor met soft tissue. The neck opening was a favorite target, as was the armpit where shields moved. A well-placed lance could unseat a rider instantly, or kill outright, but more often it disrupted formation. And disrupting formation created the real opportunities. Once the initial clash scattered enemy lines, chaos opened the door for foot soldiers and follow-up units. Knights weren't supposed to win the entire battle with one heroic charge. They were meant to punch a hole for the rest of the army to exploit. After impact, the battlefield collapsed into a swirling brawl. Horses crashed together, men fell, weapons snapped, and visibility dropped to near zero. Many knights dismounted voluntarily after the first clash. Fighting from horseback in tight spaces was dangerous. Your horse could slip, panic, or get hit by a polearm and collapse on you. A crushed leg under a warhorse spelled immediate death. On foot, knights had better control, could protect themselves with shields, and could coordinate with infantry. A knight in plate armor was extremely dangerous on foot. He wasn't the clumsy tin man movies portray. Real armor weighed around 20-30 kilos, distributed across the body like a modern tactical loadout. Knights could run, jump, pivot, and deliver powerful strikes without losing breath. The idea that they lumbered around like robots is a complete myth. Warhorses themselves were weapons. Trained destriers bit, kicked, pushed, and trampled. They didn't fear chaos because they grew up hearing clanging metal and seeing other horses in drills. They weren't everyday farm animals. They were expensive, hand-raised combat assets. Knights learned to guide them with pressure, voice commands, and reins simultaneously, while holding a lance tucked under the arm. This coordination was so complex that beginners would absolutely fail without years of practice. A knight's true weapon wasn't the lance or sword. It was the combination of man and horse functioning as one. Number 3. The sword a knight's most misunderstood tool. The sword gets all the movie glory, but it was far from the knight's main battlefield weapon. It was the Swiss army knife of medieval warfare, versatile, reliable, always at your side, but rarely the star of the show. Most battles didn't start with swords, they started with lances, spears, arrows, or polearms. The sword came out when things got personal, messy, and too close for long weapons. Knights knew swords weren't meant to hack through armor like butter. That's pure Hollywood nonsense. Try swinging a sword at plate armor, and all you'll do is hurt your wrists. That's why knights changed their sword techniques dramatically as armor evolved. Early medieval swords were wider and better for slashing at unarmored or lightly armored foes. As mail and plate armor improved, swords became narrower, stiffer, and more pointed. They were built for thrusts, not slashes. A good thrust placed correctly could slip into a gap and end a fight instantly. Half-swording became the bread and butter of armored combat. Knights would grip the blade with one hand, yes, their bare hand, and use the sword like a short spear. The lower part of the blade wasn't sharpened like a razor because it wasn't designed to slice. It was designed to be controlled. With half-swording, a knight could aim precisely for armor weak points. Manuals from the 14th and 15th centuries show pages full of diagrams demonstrating where and how to thrust. Targets included the inside of elbows, underarm gaps, groin sections, the lower back where plates overlap, and the vulnerable spot between helmet and breastplate. These manuals don't show dramatic spinning moves. They show practical thrusts, leverage-based takedowns, and dagger finishes. And speaking of finishes, the knight's dagger was the real, if all else fails, weapon. The rondel dagger was long, narrow, and reinforced, perfect for slipping into small armor gaps or through chainmail. Knights didn't stab wildly. They pinned their opponents, controlled limbs, and executed precise strikes. It sounds grim because it was grim. Knights didn't have the luxury of mouse-click distance combat. If you got close enough to use your dagger, you were fighting for your life. Another misunderstood element is how knights actually swung their swords. They didn't always go for full overhead blows. Those were too slow and left them exposed. Most strikes were short, powerful, and aimed at disrupting balance rather than slicing flesh. Knights hit with the pommel to stun, with the crossguard to hook or trap weapons, and even used the blade like a lever to twist opponents off their feet. Wrestling was fully integrated with swordplay. A knight who didn't know how to grapple was at a huge disadvantage. Armor wasn't just protection, it was a platform for grappling. You could push with your shoulder plate, drive your knee into someone's thigh, hook their ankle with your foot, or ram your helmet into their face. Swords functioned best in the chaos of close combat. When formations collapsed and soldiers mixed together in a swirling melee, the sword gave knights flexibility. It wasn't too long to get tangled. It wasn't too heavy to maneuver. It wasn't too specialized. It was the perfect backup weapon for unpredictable moments. That's why knights valued their swords, even though they weren't the most practical tools for breaking armor. A sword was always there when you needed it. It symbolized status and identity, but it also delivered when everything else went wrong. Number 4. Polearms and the real mechanics of infantry combat. When knights dismounted, or when the battlefield became too tight for mounted charges, the real kings of close-range destruction came out. Poleaxes, halberds, bills, glaives, and other polearms that movies almost never bother to show properly. These weapons weren't oversized axes meant for huge overhead swings. In skilled hands, a polearm was like 3 weapons in one: an axe blade for chopping, a hammer or spike for crushing armor, and a long thrusting point that worked like a spear. Knights loved them for one simple reason. Swords struggled against plate, but polearms did not. A well-placed poleaxe blow could dent a helmet so hard it knocked the wearer unconscious. A hook could pull a shield, or even a man off balance. And the long shaft let knights control distance, something that mattered more in real combat than almost anything else. Medieval fighters weren't trying to swing big. They were trying to make sure they didn't overextend and fall into the mud, because falling in armor in the middle of a melee was one of the fastest paths to death. Real English polearms, like the bill hook, a common weapon, soldiers used and knights sometimes adopted, weren't elegant. They were brutal agricultural tools modified for war. Curved blades designed to cut branches easily became perfect for hooking men off horses or ripping shields from hands. In the cramped horror of battle, a knight with a polearm used it almost like a lever, pushing, pulling, redirecting force, and striking when the moment opened. Combat manuals show techniques that look surprisingly modern: stepping offline, redirecting momentum, using the shaft to block and bind the enemy weapon, and finishing with thrusts to armor joints. Knights didn't just swing endlessly. Every attack had a purpose, either to damage, to destabilize, or to open the opponent for a killing blow. And contrary to popular belief, English knights often fought on foot in major battles: Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, and dozens more. Mounted charges were useful only under the right conditions. Muddy fields, narrow terrain, ditches, and dense arrow fire made riding deadly. Dismounted formations were far more stable and allowed knights to fight shoulder to shoulder with trained infantry. The poleaxe became the ultimate weapon for this style of combat. Its weight distribution allowed short, powerful strikes that could slip under shields or crack open armor plates. The spike on the back could punch through helmets or pierce mail. The top spike could drive into the throat gap if the opponent's guard slipped. And because knights wore full plate, they could commit to aggressive movements without fear of a random cut ending the fight. Fighting wasn't random chaos, it was pressure and timing. Knights advanced behind shields or raised polearms, testing the opponent's line. They waited for someone to stumble, flinch, or overreach. A single mistake could collapse a small section of the line, and once a formation broke, panic spread fast. If an enemy started backing up, knights pressed harder with coordinated steps, using the weight of their armor and weapons to bulldoze through. Unlike movies where battles drag on for 20 minutes, real engagements often ended quickly, once one side cracked mentally. And polearms were perfect for this psychological warfare. Seeing a wall of long blades and spikes advancing relentlessly would break anyone's courage. And when two armored knights met face to face with poleaxes, the fight was less about swinging and more about wrestling with 6-foot metal tools. Knights trapped each other's hafts, shoved with shoulder plates, smashed with the hammer side, or slashed at exposed thighs. The length gave them control over the engagement, letting them dictate range. And if the fight got too close, knights simply slid their hands down the shaft and used the weapon like a short staff, or even abandoned it to draw their sword or dagger. Flexibility mattered. Survival demanded adaptation. Nothing was static. Every second felt like a calculation mixed with raw instinct. Polearms also played a massive role in breaking cavalry charges. A group of dismounted knights with polearms could stop mounted riders far more effectively than shields alone. English billmen famously pulled knights from their horses, swarming them the moment they hit the ground. That's another thing movies rarely show. Most knight casualties happened after they were unhorsed, not during heroic duels. Plate armor saved lives, but if you were stuck under a panicked horse or pinned by several men, no armor could protect you forever. Number 5. The brutal, uncensored reality of medieval battlefields. Real medieval battles weren't arenas for clean sword duels. They were chaotic, filthy, terrifying, and fast. Knights didn't move through battle like choreographed dancers. They struggled through mud, dead bodies, broken shields, slippery grass soaked with rain and blood, and the constant danger of being grabbed or tripped. The battlefield ground itself was a weapon. Mud could swallow your feet, cost you balance, or make your strikes sluggish. Uneven terrain could twist your ankle, throwing you down. A single fall at the wrong moment could end a career instantly. Visibility was terrible. Through a helmet visor, a knight saw little more than the space directly in front of him. Peripheral vision was almost non-existent. Shadows inside the helmet made it harder to read movement. And the noise. God, the noise. Horses screaming, men shouting commands, dozens of weapons clanging at once, archers yelling ranges, trumpets signaling orders, the metallic ring of armor being hit. It was overwhelming. Knights trained to keep their heads clear in this sensory overload, to focus on the rhythm of breathing, and the sound of their own heartbeat thudding inside the helmet. Panic was the real enemy. The moment someone panicked, they lost the ability to fight effectively. Most medieval warfare was about formation integrity. Knights weren't lone action heroes. They were elite fighters who depended heavily on their unit. Their shield side faced their comrade. Their weapon side faced the enemy. They maintained spacing carefully. If someone stepped too far forward, they exposed their own flank. If someone fell behind, they left a gap. And knights hated gaps. Gaps meant death. That's why medieval commanders valued discipline more than raw bravery. A brave man who broke formation was a liability. A steady man who held his line was worth 10 heroes. And then there was fatigue. Armor was efficient, articulated, and surprisingly wearable. But fighting in it was exhausting. Every dodge, every strike, every grapple burned energy fast. Knights paced themselves. They didn't waste strength on pointless swings. They leaned on shields, rested weight on weapons, and shifted stances to conserve stamina. In the manuals, the most important lesson repeated again and again is, Don't fight the opponent's strength. Redirect it. Break his balance, not his body. Even in the middle of a chaotic melee, knights thought like that. They weren't just brutes. They were trained technicians of violence. But make no mistake, it was violence. When two armored fighters collided, the sound echoed across the field, a solid, sickening thud as metal hit metal, followed by grunts, scraping blades, and desperate breaths. Often, the killing blow wasn't dramatic. A knight might push his opponent down, force a knee onto his chest, and calmly drive a dagger into the visor slit. Or he might trap an enemy under his shield and strike repeatedly with the hammer side of his poleaxe until the fight stopped. These weren't glorious moments. They were survival. Most knights feared suffocation more than getting cut. Falling face first in mud with a heavy helmet on could drown you. Getting pinned under 2 or 3 bodies could crush the air out of your lungs. If an enemy grabbed your helmet and shoved your head down, your visor could clog with dirt. Many deaths listed as killed in battle were really suffocation or blunt trauma. Knights also relied on signals banners, horns, shouted commands, to know what was happening around them. Without them, battles turned into blind chaos. One wrong move could lead a knight into friendly fire or into an ambush. Many English commanders positioned knights where they could see the banners and react quickly. A knight who couldn't read the battlefield was useless, no matter how strong or skilled he was. When battles ended, knights often carried dents all over their armor, bruises on every limb, and exhaustion so deep they could barely stand. Many vomited from adrenaline overload once the fighting stopped. Some discovered broken ribs they didn't feel until hours later. Others collapsed immediately, not from injury, but from sheer physical and mental drain. And then came the grim work, helping wounded comrades, identifying bodies, pulling helmets off men who suffocated, calming terrified horses, and preparing for whatever came next. Because medieval warfare rarely ended in a clean victory. There were prisoners, ransoms, looting, and follow-up marches. Knights lived with the understanding that battle wasn't honorable or beautiful. It was controlled chaos where training, teamwork, and raw grit mattered more than anything else. Their weapons weren't for show. They were tools designed to deal with the worst conditions imaginable, and the knights who mastered them did so knowing exactly how unforgiving the battlefield truly was.